Right, good afternoon. Welcome to this Hidden London tour of Clapham South, the deep level air raid shelter. I'm Paul, I'm one of the London Transport Museum's volunteer tour guides, and for the next hour and a bit I'm going to be telling you why Clapham South and 7 other deep level air raid shelters were constructed, how they were built, what it would have been like sheltering down here during the war, what the plans were for how they would be used after the war, and what actually became of them in the years following 1945. Starting on the 7th of September 1940, London was bombed for 56 of the next 57 consecutive days and nights, and heavy bombing continued until the 10th of May 1941. This was, of course, the period known as the Blitz, during which about 40,000 people were killed and around 1 million homes were destroyed. The people of London sought shelter in their own houses in Anderson shelters, which were basically arched roof tin sheds in your garden, or Morrison shelters, which were like a reinforced steel table you could put in your living room, or seeking greater safety than those could provide. They came down into the tube stations beneath London, initially without official permission, because tube stations were not equipped to cope with the needs of many thousands of people remaining underground overnight, and tube stations could also be quite dangerous. On the 14th of October 1940, a bomb fell near Balham tube station and burst a water main, which caused water and sewage to flood into the station and drowned nearly 70 people who were sheltering there underground. The rising tide of death and destruction and growing public pressure to provide better shelters forced the government to take action, and the London Passenger Transport Board was commissioned to produce 10 deep-level underground shelters for people to stay safe from the bombing overhead. The London Passenger Transport Board was the logical choice for this construction because, of course, they are what was better known as London Transport, the predecessor of today's Transport for London, and they had considerable experience building London's underground railways. You can see one of the posters there from one of the protests demanding that these tube shelters be built, and the plans for them were really quite ambitious. If you'd like to move on a little bit down here, they initially intended to build 10 deep-level underground shelters, each of which would have been capable of accommodating 10,000 people overnight. So in total, 100,000 people sheltering deep below the ground. The shelters would be constructed underneath the Northern Line at Belsize Park, Camden Town, Goodge Street, Oval, Stockwell, Clapham North, Clapham Common, and here at Clapham South, and also underneath the Central Line at Chancery Lane and St Paul's. And we'll be finding out later on in the tour why they chose to build the shelters underneath existing tube lines. Now, as it happened, they decided for safety reasons to reduce the number of people who would be accommodated in each shelter from 10,000 down to 8,000 to avoid overcrowding and to ensure that people would be able to get in and out of the shelters safely. They also abandoned plans to construct 2 of the shelters. The one at St Paul's was cancelled due to fears that it would destabilise the foundations of the cathedral, and the shelter at Oval was abandoned in July of 1941 because of labour shortages, and then completely cancelled by December. The shelters that were built are nonetheless absolutely vast. There is over a mile of tunnel down here that we're going to be exploring, so it's very important that everyone stay closely together, because if you got lost, we would have to send out search parties. Who knows, we might never find you again. But for the people who were sheltering down here, they did have a handy way to find their way around. All these sections of the shelter that people stayed in were given names that ran in alphabetical order, and your ticket when you arrived at the shelter would have a code on it telling you where to go. For example, if you were staying in section Grenville, like on the sign behind you there, you would have a ticket which might say G236 if you were going to be sheltering in bed number 236 in Grenville section. And in a moment we're going to be going and having a look at some of the areas where people would have stayed overnight, but I think a few of you are perhaps looking a little bit peaky and need to first of all be checked in the medical bay. So let's go and have a look at where that would There were two of these medical bays at Clapham South, one at the bottom of each of the main access shafts, and they would have been equipped to cope with minor ailments and injuries and illnesses. And in the years before the founding of the National Health Service in 1948, they were a considerable attraction to people to come to the shelters because they offered free care, which would have helped improve the morale of people staying down here, keep them healthy and happy, and also encourage people to make use of the shelters. They would have been staffed by a doctor, a head nurse or sister, and also 4 more nurses. The layout of each of these medical bays would have had a reception area where we're standing in at the moment, and then a consultation room beyond that to see patients in private, and then further on towards the end of this section of tunnel there would have been a small isolation ward which could have kept 5 people separately from the rest of the shelterers if they needed to be kept away from them. And if we have a look around the space that we're standing in at the moment, we can see some of the witness marks which are evidence of how this area was used. We can see there is a vertical line in the wall there, and then another one in the wall here, and that's where there would have been a small toilet cubicle in this reception area. We can also see the ventilation duct there that would have kept it supplied with fresh air. Then if we have a look at the photograph here, we can see this electrical conduit on the ceiling is the one that we can see in the photograph there. And then we can also play a bit of the game of spot the difference with this photograph of the medical bay. You can see that the witness marks that we can see on the walls, the surviving sink there and these 2 electrical outlets, don't quite match up with what we can see in the photograph. So if you see here, we've got one outlet on the right with a pipe going downwards and one on the left with a pipe going upwards, and then if you compare that with what we've got here, it's not quite the same, which suggests that this photograph was either taken in one of the, or in the other medical bay here at Clapham South, or was perhaps taken in one of the other 7 shelters around London. You can also see another interesting bit of evidence for the shelter's construction. You can see the company for which the tunnel ring lining sections were manufactured, the London Passenger Transport Board there, or on the higher level you can see LER, which stands for London Electric Railway. That was one of the predecessors of London Transport, which was nationalised in 1933. So that suggests these tunnel sections have been lying around in a stockpile somewhere until war broke out. And we're now going to continue onwards into the shelter. I think you've all been given a clean bill of health. So we'll go onwards to some of the dormitory areas, and I'll start explaining just how these were constructed.
Well. Oh, no, there's a sink.
Oh, that was a great.
Christina thinks we're crazy for coming down there.
One of the huge dormitory sections, and I encourage you all to have a look in that direction. Welcome to Hardy section.
Wow.
Here at Clapham South there are 16 of these vast dormitories, each of which could accommodate up to 500 people potentially. The tunnels that we're standing in are each 3.7 metres in diameter. They are the same size as a mainline gauge railway tunnel, which again we'll be coming back to a little later on into the tour, why they chose that particular size. The floor that we're standing on runs across the centre of the tunnel, so it's mirrored down underneath us with a sort of U-shaped section to make the complete circular tunnel. There are two of these boards running in parallel with each other, and they're then each divided up into 4 sections. We have 2 access shafts to the tunnel at the 1/4 and 3/4 points. Those are the shafts that you came down to get into the tour today. Each of those has a double helix staircase running down the middle of it, which means people could move down into the shelter as quickly and efficiently as possible. And then there's a small lift running down the middle of the staircase that can only hold 2 or 3 people and wasn't intended for passengers. It was mostly there to bring goods and other supplies into the deep level shelters. There's also another staircase which is provided in the centre of the shelter, and that goes up into Clapham South tube station, and we'll be having a little look at that later on into the tour. And then there are these cross passageways provided at intervals along the shelter, and those are in a rather interesting figure of 8 format, which, turn around, you can see a photograph showing how those were constructed. You see, this is a photograph of one of the cross passageways, and they've got sort of half of the tunnel down here, and then it intersects with the other half, or the upper section of the tunnel above, making a bit of a figure of 8. Now, construction of the tunnels began in 1940. They started off by building these huge access shafts, and then working away from those built the double board tunnels. The tunnelling was done by teams of 7, with a lead miner, 2 assistant miners and 4 unskilled manual labourers. They worked around the clock in 2 12-hour shifts to keep work going as quickly as possible. Work was initially quite slow. They only managed to construct 2 of these tunnel lining sections per shift. Later on they managed to increase the speed by using a sort of rudimentary tunnelling shield. Now these lining rings are for about 1/3 of the tunnel in iron, which was the conventional material for making tube tunnels, and then for the other 2/3 of the shelter they are in concrete, which we can see further on down the tunnel. That was because during the war there was a shortage of iron, so they were unable to use it for the entirety of the shelters. All the spoil which was dug out of Clapham South was piled up onto Clapham Common in a mound which apparently grew to about 6 metres high and appeared, not quite overnight, but certainly without anyone being given any warning, and went sort of uncommented upon, because this was of course the era of loose lips sink ships and you never know who's listening, so people just ignored mysteriously appearing piles of spoil on their local green spaces. You can also see that there is a blast wall constructed in front of the entrance to Clapham South Station there to protect against damage from any bombs which were falling, which was quite a common feature of tube stations during the war. Now, as is always the way with major infrastructure projects, the cost of constructing the tunnels spiralled rather. It was supposed to be £1.5 million, went all the way up to £3 million by the time they were completed. That's the equivalent of about £120 million in modern money. They did, however, manage to stick to schedule, and the shelter was completed by 1942. However, by the time it had been constructed, the Blitz had died down a bit, and it was no longer quite so urgently needed. And we're now going to proceed to the next stop, where Keith will tell us what became of it then.
Come get out. I think they were going to turn this place into like a nightclub or pub or something. You can buy it, some of it, not all of it, I think. We'll ask him. Can I just quickly ask you a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Was some of this shelter recently sold for like a pub or a nightclub or something, or some sort of... I thought I saw on the news they were selling bits
None
of it.
of them are used as that. We'll come back at the end of the tour to what they're all used for today.
Okay.
But yeah, you can't really have public access by large numbers of people.
Yeah, like health and safety or
supervised
something,
closely. So.
I think there's storage down there, isn't there?
Yes, there's
Yeah.
quite a few of them in storage.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Keith Rayburn, and I'm the other guide for this tour, so I'll be taking you around along with Paul. Paul's just explained to you the way that this tunnel was built and the methods of building it and how it had to be built quite quickly. However, it wasn't quite quick enough, because by the time the deep level shelters, those 10 deep level shelters, were completed, the Blitz that happened at the start of the war, of the Second World War, had actually been completed. The threat from it had subsided and the continuous, almost nightly bombing raids had ceased. And so when the shelters were actually completed, they weren't immediately opened because there wasn't a need for them. But what they did use them for was they took the opportunity to take some photographs to show that Britain was prepared. So here is a very, very obviously posed propaganda photograph. And this was actually sent not only to our own newspapers and press in this country, but also appeared in some German newspapers, as if to show, we've got these, Britain's got these vast underground palaces, and the very worst you can throw at us, we're protecting our citizens. It's they're all looking very clean and ordered and regimented with the ARP wardens in situ there in that photograph. However, they did. It doesn't mean that there was never a need for the shelters. Far from it, because later in the war, the V1 and V2 rockets, the Doodlebugs, began falling over London, and we can see here the Evening News, evening newspaper in London from July 6th, 1944. And this was one of the first incidences of the flying bombs coming in. Flying bombs killed 2,700, injured 8,000. Very high death toll, deep shelters to open. Incidentally, that 8,000 people injured, that of course is the exact number of people that could have been kept safe in just one of these shelters. So very, very quickly, within a few days, the deep level shelters were opened up for the public to use. Paul probably mentioned earlier that initially the plan was to have 10,000 people in them. That was later revised to 8,000 to make it very, very slightly more manageable and comfortable, although not much, as we'll see at the next stop. Each of these shelter sections would have housed 500 people in bunks. 16 shelter sections in total within Clapham South. If, as well as your bunks, you did have recreation facilities. There were 2 recreation rooms for those 8,000 people, and on the way to the next stop, we're going to pass through one of those recreation rooms, and I want you to keep in mind the amount of people who are expected to use it as we do so. Will you follow me through to the next stop?
Quite long down there.
you all like to gather along a little bit down here, please? That'd be great. So you can see we're now in the bottom half of the circular cross-section of the tunnel. We're in the U-shaped bit with the roof running over the head of us, and this is one of the areas where people would have slept overnight. To get down here, you would have needed a ticket, which you had to get by applying to your local council. Most people would have to apply every single night to get a new ticket. People whose homes had been destroyed would be able to get a ticket which would last for the remainder of the wars. They'd be able to stay down here every single night. And I mentioned upstairs, your ticket would have been given a code to show which bunk you could go to, with the sections of the shelter running in alphabetical order through the first 16 letters of the alphabet. So that's running from A to, can anyone tell me the 16th letter of the alphabet?
P?
P, yes, absolutely. And the names of the shelters had a theme. So can anybody tell me, as I run through the names of the separate shelter sections, what the theme is? Can anyone spot it? So it's Anson, Beatty, Collingwood, Drake.
Cricketers.
Sorry?
Cricketers?
No, Drake, Evans, Fremantle, Grenville, Hardy, Inglefield, Jellicoe.
Admirals?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't need to get Nelson there. You got it beforehand. Yes, they're all named after, well, British naval commanders, certainly. And the other shelters around London had themes for their names as well, including sculptors and painters, engineers, poets, famous writers, great military leaders, and great British political leaders as well. So it was something to boost the morale of people staying down here, I think, by reminding them of some great British icons. Now, when you came down with your ticket, you would need to also bring everything that you would need overnight. You'd have to bring your own mattress, you'd have to bring your own blankets or sheets, you'd have to bring your own pillow, because none of that was provided for shelterers. That would be quite a lot to lug down those spiral staircases. You'd also need to bring your gas mask, because there was, of course, a fear of gas attack, and unlike the main government bunkers, there was no gas locking system here at Clapham South to keep poison gas out. And once you got down here, there would be these triple-decker bunks for people to stay in overnight, like we see here. On this side of the shelter, they would have been transverse, and then on the other side of the corridor, there would have been more bunks. They would have been running longitudinally as well in 3 sections. So there would have been up to 500 people potentially crammed into this area. Now, we know that the shelter was never used to its maximum capacity. The greatest number of people staying across all the 5 shelters that were open to the public during the war was 12,297 on the 24th of July 1944. That was about 30% of the capacity of those shelters. That would have been about 2,500 people maybe down here at Clapham. And that means that there was a little bit of extra space. We know from Margaret Barford, who sheltered down here as a child, that families were given entire bays to use for their own personally, so they did have a little bit more privacy. And people actually brought some extra things down with them to slightly personalise their areas they were staying in and give them a little bit of a touch of home. Margaret Barford tells us that sometimes people brought bits of carpet down to put on the floor, which would otherwise be cold concrete, and also brought curtains down to give themselves a bit more privacy. Now, we also know from Margaret Barford that it would be very cold down here, and that's because 1,000 people staying down here. Provision, of course, had to be made for those who might need to answer a call of nature. And there were lavatories provided at either end of each level of the tunnel sections, so 4 sets of lavatories in total with male and female in each. You can see in the photograph here what one of the male lavatories, of course, this one with the urinals inside, would have looked like. And if you have a look around the walls next to you, I think if you have a look at the witness marks, you might be able to tell which of the lavatories we're standing in at the moment. Of course, you can see the marks where the urinals would have been attached on the walls there. Entirely coincidentally, marks that look rather like a London Transport ground. Now, of course, for people who had other business to conduct, there were cubicles, and those cubicles were rather rudimentary. They had what were called Elsan toilets, which were basically a bucket with some disinfectant poured into the bottom of them, And if you were the unfortunate person who filled up the buckets, it was your responsibility to then take it to this slop hopper at the end of the toilets and empty it into the hopper. And you can see on the photograph here, one of these hoppers being one of these buckets being emptied into a hopper at Piccadilly Circus, where there was also a tube station being used as a shelter. Now, we know from Margaret Barford, who sheltered down here as a girl, that apparently people didn't tend to quite always empty the buckets when they were supposed to. They would just sort of saunter out and no, nothing to do with me. And in that case, it was often the responsibility of the shelter staff to empty the buckets into the hopper. She also said that the smell down here was absolutely ghastly, and people would do everything they could to avoid having to use the toilet, so they'd make sure they went before they came downstairs and then wait until they went out in the morning. Now, this slop hopper emptied into a tank which could hold up to 5,500 gallons of human waste. That was enough for the 8,000 people who might be staying in the shelter to last for 5 days. However, once it was filled up, it had to have all its waste pumped up to the surface because, of course, we're 36.5 metres underground. The sewage pipes run just underneath the road, so they're something like 30 metres above our heads. So to get the waste upwards, compressed air was forced into the tank and then pumped all the way up the pipes towards the sewers. You had to make sure that you sealed all the valves very, very tightly before letting the compressed air into the tank, because if you didn't get them quite right, everything would come squirting out in entirely the wrong direction and give you a rather unpleasant shower. And there weren't any proper showers down here, so you wanted to make quite sure that didn't happen. Now, this screen down here, as well as being a photograph, will also show us a short movie showing a bit of propaganda about how brilliant these shelters were.
London under the flying bomb. Battle of Britain conditions returned in the form of robot warfare on the capital. It's a civilian battle again. Citizens are both the target and the defenders. Every day, folk don their steel helmets and take duty on the rooftops. The bomb spotters who keep watch during daytime alerts and sound the warnings when immediate danger threatens. London's wartime calendar of experience may be set back 4 years, but the people adjust themselves to the frontline peril and carry on. 8 new deep shelters are now open for the accommodation of Londoners. Over 100 feet underground, they're the last word in design. Double staircases and emergency lifts bring you into well-appointed quarters. Each has accommodation for 8,000 people who will sleep in tiered bunks.
These are the longitudinal bunks.
Precautions against the spreading of infection are thorough. Families are provided with cubicles in these shelters. Staffs of hospitals, doctors and ambulance crews have been appointed. The medical aid post is another feature of this ARP enterprise, which was built in the 1940 Blitz days and now used for the first time. Indirect lighting, air conditioning, dormitories for babies and comfortable canteens are all available to the people who shelter in these luxury tunnels below London.
So if you'd like to follow us out this way in the rest, please.
Yeah, it's true, actually. You just say that to it.
Okay, so the area where we're now standing, that you probably worked out from the photograph, is one of the canteen areas. We know that by looking, well, we know it now by looking at the photos, but the reason we knew to put these photos here when we were researching the tour is from looking at witness marks. You can see the raised area here and the different colour of paint. You can see the green paint only covers the top half of the poles there, because that was all that was required for the panel work for the counters. So this was one of 4 canteens, 2 on this lower level where we are at the moment, and another 2 on the upper level, serving the shelter as a whole. They were staffed by voluntary organisations, the Women's Royal Voluntary Service and various other organisations like that, and they provided food for the shelterers down here. You can see the kind of stuff that was sold: tea, sandwiches, cake, cocoa. You might notice a pattern emerging in the pricing there. Essentially everything's tuppence. Tea, sandwiches, and actually the going rate for a cup of tea up on the surface in a cafe or whatever would have actually been a penny. So that was quite a markup at the time, and there was at least one occasion where someone complained to the superintendent of the shelter about the price of tea down here. To which the response was, well, if you want to go up during an air raid and get your tea for a penny, be my guest. Whether there are any takers, we don't know. But one of the advantages of it's the same today, I suppose, when they have a captive market. But as you can see from that photo, certainly amongst the children at least, it seems very popular indeed. I'm not sure about the hygiene of those sandwiches, though, just all piled up on one plate. But nobody seems to be complaining. And indeed, Margaret Barford, child shelterer, said she liked the jam tarts. And actually, it would have been a treat for children and adults alike, because one little perk was that the food down here was off ration. The rationing didn't apply down here, and obviously things like jam tarts and anything pastry or butter, it was very difficult to get that sort of thing. So therefore, things like that were a rarity. The reason, well, it's a stressful situation to be down in a shelter, and so it was thought that for morale reasons it would be good to have the food off ration. And actually, I suspect the government could still control the food levels, because obviously they supply so much and no more, so they supply the amount for the people that are down here, and it does a little bit to keep the spirits up. So that was one fact about it. Another was that this was the only area in the whole shelter where you were not permitted to smoke. So if you were standing at the buffet counter, you couldn't smoke. But it was only from here to the first bunk there, where there'd be a curtain across. Smoking was permitted everywhere else in the shelter. 80% of the adult population smoked at this time. It would have been inconceivable to prevent people from puffing away at their pipes in bed or wherever they were staying. So that was the other thing. Another little clue that tells us we're here. There's a big fuse box here. There's this buffet fuse box. So you can see the almost like a little mini community, mini town down here. All these facilities were put in. If you'd like to follow Paul through now to the next stop, we're going to hear about planning for the future.
Which is the abbreviation for Bundesland in Deutschland.
Where does it say that?
She is going to do some.
I don't see BRD. Oh, board. Yeah, fuse board.
She's very, very elderly. She came to do some oral history, record some memories.
Oh, old money. I don't know exactly. It's like shillings or something.
Okay, so these are new. So some of the photos you will see are bunks, long ways here. You have bunks here that fold down onto the floor back. So not these walls, we're only here. No, I'm not here. Yes. So still looking at the top one like in that video.
The differences between the different lights?
It does vary quite a lot, yeah. They work out the same roughly.
And do you actually go to any of the other stores, or is this all?
Yeah, so one over here.
might have noticed in that newsreel film and propaganda photos, the original signage down here would have been the proper London Transport Johnston type place. At some point since the end of the war, it seems to have been painted over and replaced by someone whose typographical skills were not quite up to those of Lady Johnston. You can see on the sign behind you, for example, it's been rather squished together, the Madam and Oldham, and then there's a different shape of O in Oldham, Nelson and Lavatory. It's very inconsistent there. But the comprehensive signage down here is just one of the examples of how well planned these shelters were for their use during the war. We've seen the buffet counter, we've seen the toilets, huge numbers of bunks which were fitted down here, the provisions for emergencies, and the planning went beyond their use during the war and into how the shelters were intended to be used after the war had ended. We've seen that they were constructed beneath stations on the Northern Line and the Central Line, and that the main tunnels of the shelter are 3.7 metres in diameter, wide enough to run a mainline train through once you took the intermediate floor out. And that's because the intention was that after the war, the shelters would become part of new express versions of the Northern and Central lines. Back in the 1940s, use of the Northern and Central lines was extremely high. They were overcrowded, as is still the case today, and it was decided it would be advantageous to build express versions of these lines, which would have fewer stations on them, so people could cross London much more quickly, and they would use these huge mainline-sized tunnels so you could run full-size mainline trains down the tunnels rather than small tube-profile trains. Now, the idea was that the sections of shelter were to be built beneath stations where the new express tubes would not stop. They would become running tunnels, and all these running tunnels which were built as shelters would then be joined up, and new stations would be constructed at the areas where it was decided there would be stations where these trains would stop on the new express lines. So Clapham South would have been one of these through places where the trains wouldn't stop. This staircase leading up behind me leads straight up into present-day Clapham South station. It was not intended to be used during the war, although we do know from Margaret Barclays that actually people did, once they'd woken up in the morning, sometimes go straight up these stairs into the stations to catch their trains to work after sheltering here overnight. The idea was that this staircase after the war would be used by London Underground staff to access the running tunnels on this new express tube line if they needed to get in here for maintenance. However, as we can see, there aren't any express Northern Line trains running down here. Crossrail 2 did not happen nearly a century ahead of when it will actually finally be constructed. And the reason for that is that in the years after the war, of course, the British economy was in tatters. The country needed to be completely rebuilt. Huge amounts of aid had to come in under a Marshall Plan from the United States. Much of it was spent on not only reconstructing the country, but the foundation of the modern National Health Service and the welfare state. And there simply were not funds available to start constructing duplicate express tube lines. So unfortunately for present-day Londoners, the grand plans for express versions of the Northern and Central lines never came to fruition. This was, of course, also the era when the population of London was falling rather than growing as people moved out into the suburbs or into other new towns that were constructed. It was the era when the car was seen as the future rather than public transport, so there just wasn't the will to ever start building these new railways. Now, you might wonder, could they, in this era when London is growing again and when transport's in ever greater demand, could they finally realise the dream? Could they join all these tunnels up and turn them into a new high-speed tube line? Well, in theory it would be possible, but it would actually offer no advantage whatsoever given modern tunnelling techniques, and just building a brand new tunnel somewhere else. You wouldn't save any money by trying to join up a load of 1940s tunnels, so it's extremely unlikely, pretty much impossible in fact, that these will ever become railway tunnels. But despite never having been used for trains, they did contribute in quite an interesting way to the shaping of modern London, and we're now going to continue on Clapham South, where Keith will explain just how that came about.
What is the difference? I mean, off the overground and the above.
It's above us, yes, we're running roughly parallel to these tunnels. It's further than it sounds, I think it's about 10 metres.
Roughly 10 metres.
Yeah, because if you go up the stairs, it's about 4 or 5 degrees
stories in the morning. This is their way out.
So theoretically,
It is bricked up. Yeah, just cut the brick. Yeah, there's no door. But yeah,
Right,
it would go the same. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so Paul's told us about the dire state that the economy was in, and part of the reason for that was the shortage of labour, people of working age, skilled and unskilled. Many of the men who went to war sadly didn't return, and there was a huge shortage of labour in this country. And so therefore large organisations, London Transport being one of them, but also the government as a whole, the Ministry of Work, or the Employment Service, as I call it, Ministry of Labour, as they were known then as an official title, looked to the colonies for people to fill that skills gap. So there was recruitment taking place. London Transport even sent recruitment agents to Jamaica to set up agencies there to try and recruit people. At the time, there were no immigration restrictions on travelling from one part of the British Empire to another. So if you lived in Jamaica, as these gentlemen did, there was nothing to stop you. You would have considered yourself a British subject. You were nothing to stop you coming to Britain if you wanted. And the opportunity presented itself with a ship called the Empire Windrush, which found itself in the West Indies, travelling from Jamaica to the UK in 1948. Now, it was originally actually a German ship, but the UK seized it as a war prize during the war and used it for their own ends. And so subsidised passage was offered on this ship. I think was it £25?
£28.50.
There you go, £28.50, which would have been 1,300. Have I got that right in today's money? Okay. My script's obviously an old one. You memorise it and then they update it. So about £750 one-way passage. So whilst it was subsidised, and that did represent that was a very, very cheap price for a one-way passage at that time for such a distance. No cheap flights at that time, of course. You still had to be reasonably well off in order to afford it. These weren't desperate economic migrants doing this. These were probably middle-class people who perhaps wanted to kind of move up the ladder and make a better life, perhaps for be aspirational, make a better life, perhaps for their family back home. So this gentleman, Mr. Brown. Was one of many who were billeted at Clapham South, because about half of those migrants had somewhere organised to stay, the other half didn't. And so as a very, very short-term solution, they were actually billeted down here at Clapham South. They didn't stay very long, and they didn't think much of it, from all accounts, although they were no doubt very polite about it at the time. They stayed here for sort of 2 to 3 weeks, generally, and spent before they found lodgings and found employment, which of course there was no shortage of. It's reported that on the first night they turned up off the boat in Jamaica, they were offered traditional Caribbean fare of roast beef, Yorkshire puddings, followed by spotted dip and custard. Not in the canteen, but in a marquee on Clapham Common, so quite a welcome. I don't know what they thought of that, and indeed Mr. Brown said he lost a stone in weight, so perhaps it wasn't quite what he was used to, but that could have also been the conditions. He said he had very little sleep. You had the trains rumbling, of course, just as you do today. So they made their way in the world rather quickly. The nearest labour exchange, today's version of what we would call a job centre, was in Brixton, and that was where all these gentlemen registered. And it's for that reason that many of them ended up settling in what was a very white working class area at the time, and contributing therefore to the ethnic diversity of London by creating that Caribbean community that is, of course, still very, very much in place today. So another feature of the regiment in Nigeria, they still had to be out every morning to look for work, and they would be woken in a rather unorthodox manner. Someone would come along and ring a bell and shout, "Wakey, wakey!" So doubtless another reason not to stay too long. But this was just one sort of fairly short-term facility, but there were longer-term ingenious uses of the shelter after the war as well. If you follow Paul, he'll tell you about one of those. Well, there's something techniques to the underground and same to this back on the I know schools have got enough space for like they need to have that space between the door line and the crossroads tunnels to grow. That's yes, when they were building the Westminster the link between Big Ben and that's the reason they were all built on underground.
In 1951, to promote British industry and culture and help encourage the reconstruction of the country in the years after the war, the government put on the Festival of Britain. This was a grand event that was centred on the South Bank, where there was the huge Dome of Discovery that displayed British scientific advances. There was something called the Skylon Tower, huge, great big structure, many metres high, and the Royal Festival Hall, which is the only surviving major structure from the Festival of Britain now Grade 1 listed. About 8 million people in total visited the Festival of Britain during 1951, and many of them stayed here at Clapham South. The shelter was renamed the Festival Hotel for the event. People staying here had to pay 3 shillings a night. Things were a tiny bit more luxurious than when it had been a wartime shelter. The bunks had been reduced from triple tier to 2 tier, and spaced slightly further apart, and they turned sections of the shelters into small restaurants rather than just these stand-up canteens. You can see tables here, but I'm not sure this gentleman was too impressed by the provisions that had been put on for them. I think things were still rather rudimentary. We know that most of the people who stayed down here in the Festival Hotel were visiting school parties, large numbers of children, and they seem to have left something of a mark behind them, which Keith is now going to show us.
You want to follow me, please?
Yeah, that's good, isn't it?
When he said they're doing 60 tours a day.
Oh, right.
It's still, I think, 4 weeks. 6 tours.
Blimey.
So you're not always taking.
Yeah.
So here we are in Fremantle Shelter, and we've dressed this to show the much higher levels of luxury that were available in the Festival Hotel. As you can see, not only is it 2 bunks rather than 3, and we can see this photo to show what it looked like, but there's also sheets and blankets on the beds. You don't have to bring your own anymore. Those days are gone, although I have to say you only got a sheet, actually, if you were a lady. The gentlemen, you had separate dormitories as well, sexes in different shelters, which you didn't have, of course, in the shelter days. That was another sort of step up. But if you were a gentleman, you only got a harsh blanket. You didn't get a soft sheet. But that's what it was like. So as Paul mentioned, it was a lot of youth organisations and school parties. So Scouts, Guides. I know that the Girls Friendly Society, whoever they may be, stayed down here. As well, and actually it was used as well to billet troops, particularly troops and police officers during the coronation of our present Queen in 1952. Many of the troops involved in either security or involved in the sort of mounted processions or household cavalry and stuff. Those who came from places distant to London will also spend time down here. As Paul mentioned, some of them left their mark, and of course it's upside down because, of course, they're lying on their bunk, scratching it in. So we've got all sorts of people have come from all sorts of exotic places to visit the Festival of Britain. We've got a bee copse from near Brussels in Belgium. We've got someone from a little village in France called Jean-Lépine. I don't know where that is, but it says France, helpfully. And exotic places, Swindon as well. That's from a military camp near Swindon. So all sorts of places. Now, whilst there were British troops sheltering here, the shelter at Goodge Street had always been under control of the military, as indeed it remains so today, and it was given over to US troops when they entered the war and were billeted here, and also after the war as well. I think it's fair to say that some of those US troops didn't think much of their accommodation. I think if we ever did a tour there at Goodge Street, we probably couldn't show you the graffiti. It's very, very uncomplimentary indeed. And much of it's actually burnt on with lighters, although there was a lot more soot there. If you've ever been down a coal mine or anything like that, you've seen people burn things on with lighters. Well, the inevitable happened, didn't it? Someone was burning their graffiti with a lighter, dropped the lighter, caused a small fire, which created a lot of smoke. Nobody injured or killed, but it rather panicked the authorities, and in a magnificent example of reactive management, they decided that suddenly that overnight sheltering in the deep level shelters were no longer safe. It was not to happen anymore, despite the fact that it was perfectly fine in the war, and that's what they were built for. They suddenly decided that it was too much of a fire risk, and so all used for things like the Festival Hotel and billeting troops in all of the shelters ceased, and so they had to become even more ingenious in finding uses for these very, very unusual spaces. So if you follow Paul and I through to the next stop, you'll find out what they were. On the way, we're going to go past one of the smaller sub-control rooms. There's 3 telephones in there. I'm not going to stop, but just keep in there and have a look at them. There's one telephone to the surface, one to the other shelters as well.
That's the stairway up to the tube station.
found out on the day release, and then decided to take it out, and then we decided to get it out.
No, the entrance to the tube station is actually completely ripped off.
Probably wouldn't know anyway.
And no, going deeper underground, you wouldn't help anyone.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Weird, isn't it? Yeah. Imagine you lived down there.